Most people think they know the difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. One group came from Europe, the other from Spain and the Middle East. Simple, right? But then, a geneticist opened a spreadsheet she had been waiting 3 years to see. Raw DNA data, rows, columns, chromosomes, and right there, around row 4000, she stopped scrolling. Because inside the genomes of these two ancient communities, science found things that should not exist. Slavic markers from vanished kingdoms in Eastern European men, North African Berber traces hidden deep in Sephardic mothers. Today, we are looking at a genetic record that is quietly rewriting history. By the end of this, you'll understand what a bottleneck of just 350 people does to 10 million descendants, and how two branches of the same family tree ended up looking like complete strangers. Let's get into it. But before we get to the steppe horsemen and the hidden North African mothers, you need to understand something that sounds almost too simple to matter. You need to understand what these two words, Ashkenazi and Sephardic, actually meant to the people who carried them for centuries. Because it was never just a label, it was an entire inheritance, passed down the way a family passes down a recipe or a scar, without anyone ever writing the instructions down. Here's the thing nobody tells you when they explain Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. They make it sound like a simple split. One group went to Europe, the other went to Spain. Done. End of story. But that's the textbook version. And the textbook version is wrong in almost every way that matters. Both of these communities really do share the same starting point. That part checks out. Ancient DNA studies confirm it again and again. Somewhere around 3,000 years ago. Both trace back to the same small strip of land on the Eastern Mediterranean, the hills of Judah, the streets of ancient Jerusalem. If you could rewind far enough, you'd find one people, one language, one temple, one shared history. Then the Romans came, and that single population began to scatter in two directions. And everything after that point is where the story splits. Follow the Western thread first. After the Roman exile, Jewish communities drifted along the Mediterranean coastline until they settled in Spain and Portugal, in a region they called Sepharad. And here's what most people never picture correctly. These weren't isolated, struggling outposts hiding in the shadows under Muslim rule. Sephardic communities became part of one of the most advanced civilizations on earth. Physicians, astronomers, poets, Maimonides, one of the greatest minds in Jewish history, was Sephardic. These people weren't surviving on the margins. They were shaping the world around them. Walk through Cordoba or Toledo in the 10th or 11th century, and you would have found Jewish scholars translating Greek philosophy into Arabic, then into Hebrew, sitting in libraries that dwarfed anything Christian Europe had at the time. This wasn't a footnote in Jewish history. For a while, it was the center of it then. In 1492, the door slammed shut. The Spanish crown gave every Jew in the kingdom two options: convert or leave. Hundreds of thousands chose exile. They scattered into the Ottoman Empire, into North Africa, into the Balkans, carrying their language, their prayer books, and without knowing it, their DNA, into every port city that would take them in. Now follow the Eastern thread, because this is the one that gets strange fast. While the Sephardim were building a golden age in Spain, a much smaller, much quieter group of Jewish merchants was moving north through Italy into the Rhine Valley, into towns with names like Mainz and Worms and Speyer. This was the seed of everything we now call Ashkenazi Jewry: small, fragile, not remotely prepared for what was coming. Because unlike the Sephardim, who kept trading, marrying, and mixing across the Mediterranean world for centuries, the early Ashkenazi communities got pushed into something closer to total isolation. Ghetto walls, laws that forbade them from owning land, restrictions on what work they could even do, and for hundreds of years, they married almost exclusively within their own community, generation after generation, in towns most of their neighbors wanted them out of. Here's where you need to lean in, because this next part is the hinge the entire story swings on. There's a term in population genetics called the founder effect. Picture a huge, diverse population getting funneled down to a tiny handful of survivors. Through war, disease, exile, isolation, whatever the cause, every person alive after that point descends from that small remaining group. Whatever traits, whatever mutations those few people happen to carry, get locked into the bloodline and repeated over and over in every generation that follows, like a photocopy of a photocopy. Now here's the number that should genuinely stop you. Researchers studying the genetic history of Ashkenazi Jews have traced the entire modern population, roughly 10 million people scattered across the planet today, back to a founding group that may have numbered as few as 350 individuals, living in medieval Europe roughly 800 years ago. 350 people, that's smaller than most high schools. And from that narrow, fragile thread, an entire people grew. Hold on to that number, because it's going to come back later, in a way you won't expect. For now, just sit with the strangeness of it. 10 million descendants, 350 ancestors. Every single person in that modern population is in some distant, invisible way related to every other person, because there simply weren't enough founders to spread the bloodline thin. You can see the fingerprints of that bottleneck written directly into the health of Ashkenazi Jews today. Tay-Sachs disease, a devastating condition that destroys the nervous system in early childhood, occurs in this population at roughly 10 times the rate seen anywhere else on Earth. Gaucher disease, familial dysautonomia, Canavan disease, and the BRCA gene mutations, the ones tied to breast and ovarian cancer, show up in roughly 1 out of every 40 Ashkenazi women, compared to about 1 in 500 in the general population. Sit with that for a second. That is not bad luck scattered randomly across a community. That is mathematics. When your entire population comes from a few hundred founders, whatever they were carrying gets passed forward at a scale no larger, more diverse population would ever produce. It isn't a flaw in these people. It's a flaw in the arithmetic of surviving under conditions that never should have allowed survival at all. Remember that number I told you to hold on to? 350 people. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Every disease we just named, every mutation, every elevated risk was already sitting inside that tiny founding group 800 years ago, waiting. Nobody chose it, nobody could have known. A handful of medieval families simply happened to carry certain mutations, and because there were so few of them to begin with, those mutations never had the chance to get diluted the way they would in a larger population. History picked the founders, mathematics did the rest. The Sephardic side went through something different, not one brutal narrowing, but several smaller ones stacked on top of each other. The expulsion from Spain, resettlement in the Ottoman world, new communities splitting off in Thessaloniki, in Istanbul, in Fez, each one creating its own small founder effect as families broke away and rebuilt somewhere new. Sephardic Jews from Morocco carry a different genetic signature than Sephardic Jews from Turkey. Different again from those in the Balkans, all of them still tracing back to the same Iberian route, but shaped by wherever the wind of exile happened to drop them. And here's the part that flips the whole disease narrative on its head. Because genetics rarely gives you a clean villain, that same brutal isolation that handed Ashkenazi Jews their disease burden also forged something unexpected. Scientists studying immune system genes in this population found an unusually wide range of immune response variants, a kind of biological toolkit shaped by centuries of confinement. Some researchers believe that diversity may have given Ashkenazi communities a real survival advantage during the plague waves that tore through medieval Europe. A bottleneck isn't only a narrowing, sometimes. Brutally, it's also a forge. Now here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because what the DNA found buried inside both communities doesn't match the version either group, or their critics, has ever wanted to tell. When researchers ran large-scale studies on the Y chromosomes of Ashkenazi men, they expected to find the ancient Middle Eastern marker dominating the results. The genetic signature tied to the earliest Semitic populations of the Levant. That marker is there, but it only shows up in 10 to 15% of Ashkenazi men. The rest carry something else entirely. A marker most closely tied to Slavic and Eastern European populations. Another tied to the Caucasus Mountains. Another tracing back to the open plains of Central Asia. Where did that come from? For over a century, one theory has haunted Jewish historians more than any other. The Khazars, a powerful Turkic empire that once controlled the steppes of Eastern Europe between the 7th and 10th centuries. Multiple medieval sources, Arab chroniclers, Byzantine records, Jewish letters, describe the ruling elite of that empire converting to Judaism when the Khazar state finally collapsed. Its people scattered west into the exact territories where Ashkenazi communities were beginning to take shape. It matters to say clearly, this remains debated. Later, broader genetic studies have pushed back hard against the Khazar theory, finding Ashkenazi ancestry lining up more closely with Levantine and European populations than with a Central Asian steppe empire. But that Slavic-linked marker sitting inside so many Ashkenazi men hasn't fully gone away either, and researchers are still arguing over exactly what it means. What we can say honestly is this: the full story of who joined this bloodline and when is still being written one study at a time, now turned to the Sephardim, because their ghost ancestors point in a completely different direction south. Not north, west, not east. Studies of Sephardic maternal lines have picked up North African, Berber-linked genetic markers running through communities whose own oral history never mentioned any such connection. Centuries of life in Muslim Spain weren't lived behind a sealed wall. Jewish women married into surrounding communities. Neighbors crossed lines that religion drew on paper, but daily life kept quietly erasing. When Sephardic families resettled across North Africa after the expulsion, some of those Moroccan communities carried detectable Berber ancestry through their maternal lines. A fingerprint left by centuries nobody wrote down carefully enough until the DNA filled in what the history books missed. Two communities, two sets of hidden ancestors, both buried in plain sight, inside the genome, waiting 1,000 years to be found. And this bleeds directly into something you can still hear today, if you know what you're listening to, language. Yiddish was born in those early Rhineland communities, built on a skeleton of medieval German, but it absorbed Hebrew for anything sacred. And later, as families pushed east into Poland and Lithuania, it pulled in Slavic grammar and vocabulary until it became something entirely its own. By the 19th century, Yiddish wasn't a dialect, it was a full civilization, with its own theater, its own newspapers, its own literature, spoken by millions of people in a tongue that existed nowhere else on the map. Ladino grew the same way on the other side of the story, built on medieval Spanish exactly as it was spoken, the moment before the expulsion in 1492. And when Sephardic families scattered into the Ottoman world, that Spanish froze in place, like an insect caught in amber, while the language back in Spain kept changing without them. Ladino picked up Hebrew, then Turkish, then Greek, then Arabic. Depending on which port city it landed in, here's the piece almost nobody connects. The same isolation that kept a language alive and separate for 500 years is the same isolation that kept a genome drifting apart for 500 years. The ghetto walls and the legal restrictions that boxed Ashkenazi Jews away from their neighbors weren't only social boundaries, they were genetic ones. Language was never just a way of speaking, it was a fortress, a way of marking exactly who belonged inside the walls without ever needing to draw a physical line. You can see the same fingerprint in ritual. Ashkenazi prayer melodies carry the modal patterns of Eastern European folk music. Sephardic liturgical chant follows the maqam scales of Ottoman and Arab tradition. Ashkenazi Torah scrolls are dressed in soft fabric and laid down to be read. Sephardic scrolls are housed in rigid wooden cases and stand upright. Ashkenazi families name children only after the dead. Sephardic families name children after the living. None of that is trivial. Every one of those differences is a fossil, a record of a different set of neighbors, a different sky, a different set of pressures shaping ordinary life across 15 centuries of separation. And then, in the 20th century, everything that had been pulled apart for 1,500 years got put back in the same room. The founding of Israel in 1948 did something genetics had never seen before at this scale. It took two populations that had been drifting apart since before the fall of Rome and dropped them into the same small strip of land. Ashkenazi families arriving from Europe carrying the trauma of what had just happened there. Sephardic and Mizrahi families arriving from Morocco, Iraq, Yemen, Iran. Within a single generation, people who had never shared a street were sharing schoolrooms, army units, and eventually households. Studies tracking this reunion over the last 2 decades show something quietly remarkable. Children born from Ashkenazi Sephardic unions carry broader genetic diversity than either parent line alone. The disease mutations concentrated by centuries of isolation are, generation by generation, beginning to thin out. Not because anyone planned it that way, just because two ancient rivers, separated for 1,500 years, finally found their way back into the same delta. But I won't pretend it's been a clean, easy homecoming, because inside Israel, the space between these two communities has carried real weight since the earliest years of the state. Ashkenazi families, arriving earlier and often with more resources, ended up shaping the country's universities, its government, its military leadership. Sephardic and Mizrahi families, arriving later, often from very different circumstances, frequently found themselves at the bottom of a ladder they had no hand in building. That tension has a name, several names actually, and it has shaped Israeli politics for 70 years. It still does. Genetics doesn't erase that history, but it does something almost more powerful. It removes the ground underneath it, because the one thing you cannot say anymore, after looking at the actual data, is that either community holds a more authentic claim to this ancient identity than the other. The Ashkenazi genome, with its Slavic markers and European mothers, is not less Jewish than the Sephardic genome. With its Berber threads and Ottoman influence, they are the same root, grown through two completely different storms. What the DNA actually hands us, once you stop looking for a winner, is something better than hierarchy. It's complementarity. One line carrying immune adaptations forged in the cold isolation of Northern Europe. The other carrying a different set, shaped by Mediterranean heat and Ottoman cities and North African deserts, put back together. The combined population carries more range, more resilience, more depth than either branch ever had alone. So here's where this actually lands. Not on a headline about ancient tribes or hidden bloodlines. On something much quieter, two communities separated for 15 centuries never stopped being one people. They just became one people wearing two different faces, shaped by two different skies. The Khazar marker sitting in some Ashkenazi men doesn't make them less connected to Jerusalem. The Berber thread running through some Sephardic mothers doesn't dilute their claim to that same ancient hill. What both of those things prove, quietly, permanently, written into the actual chemistry of these people, is that surviving 1,500 years scattered across two continents was never about staying pure. It was about staying recognizable. About carrying something so deep that new neighbors, new languages, and even new bloodlines could get folded in without ever managing to erase it. That's not a story about genetics in the end. That's a story about what it actually takes to survive as a people when the whole world keeps trying to make you disappear. Think about the woman in that lab again, the one scrolling through row after row of letters and numbers, looking for a story hidden inside a spreadsheet. She wasn't looking for villains or heroes. She wasn't looking for who was more real, more pure, more entitled to the name. She was looking for the truth, and the truth turned out to be quieter and stranger than anyone expected. Two families, torn apart by exile, rebuilt themselves out of whatever was left. Out of a few hundred survivors here, a scattering of converts there, a few unrecorded marriages nobody thought worth writing down, and somehow, against every mathematical odd, both of them made it all the way to now, still lighting the same candles, still reading the same scrolls, still carrying, in the smallest and most literal sense, the same ancient code. Somewhere in a spreadsheet, in a lab, on a random afternoon, the numbers finally said out loud what these families had been proving quietly. For 1,500 years, all along, they never disappeared. They just changed shape long enough to survive.